Chapter 4. Sharp Edges. When he turns away again and quietly leaves, Greg stays behind, utterly bewildered and hurt. Perhaps it has less to do with practical concerns than it has to do with hurt feelings. Whatever the reason, Greg completely drops the subject of finding Sherlock a laboratory. He keeps his distance for a few months, only checking in when there's a suitably complicated crime, and he does his best to keep his attitude in check. After all, Sherlock had been perfectly clear. Whatever they are to each other, they aren't friends. In fact, Sherlock's continued to reinforce that point ever since that night at the hospital, alternating between disdainful brevity and barbed insults whenever they've had to share space with one another. He seems determined to press every last one of Greg's buttons, to push the boundaries as far as he can. But Greg just as stubbornly refuses to crack. He's promised to keep Sherlock involved in his work, and that's as much a vow to himself as anything, so he grimly accepts whatever comes his way. Be it cruel dismissals of Greg's years of experience, or childish pranks more suited to a boy of 10 than a man just turned 31, he lets it all roll off his shoulders. Well, not all of it. He can't help indulging in a little bit of a private sulk now and then. A few months later, when March is almost wound down, Greg swings by the beige building in Marylebone. A case that's been stalled for days is finally starting to pick up speed, but Sherlock has been maddeningly inconsistent in the timing of his responses to text messages just lately. It's probably meant as another volley in the strange, silent war between them, which is why Greg has taken the initiative to track him down in person. As it turns out, his door is already opening as Greg reaches the third-story landing. Sherlock is dressed uncharacteristically nicely in tailored trousers and a bright teal button-down, rather than his usual dark jeans and plain gray. A suit jacket drapes over his arm. "On my way out, Lestrade," he mutters, taking a gliding step away from the partially open door. "Yeah, okay, this won't take long," Greg replies, but before he can say more, the door swings wider, and a woman emerges. His double take is involuntary, though her loose chignon has gone white in the years since he last saw her in a vision. Sherlock's mother has aged remarkably well. He clears his throat to cover his surprise. "Sorry, Sherlock, I didn't know you had company, but can I just snag you for 1 second? Look, I brought by the photos you wanted, all the doorsteps on the row." Sherlock frowns and takes the stack of photographs as Mummy speaks. "Oh, is this a friend of yours then, Sherlock?" "Colleague," Greg quickly puts in, twitching a glance to catch Sherlock's glare. "He's my consultant, helping me to solve a murder case. I don't mean to delay you, ma'am." "Myra Holmes," she smiles, offering a benevolent hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Yes, pleasantries tedious," snaps Sherlock. "Number 53, Detective Inspector Lestrade. The pattern of scratches around the latch indicates a left-handed habitual drinker. Telltale scuffing and light flecks, chalk on the doorsill. You're bound to find traces of the same chalk tracked inside the flat, matching that observed at the second scene. If that isn't more than enough for you to go on with, you can text me news of your incompetence tomorrow. Come along, Mother." Mrs. Holmes sends a shocked look towards Greg upon hearing her son's tone, but as Sherlock crosses behind him to storm off down the stairs, Greg quirks a small smile and shakes his head slightly. "It's nothing," he assures her wordlessly. She studies him for a moment, and then her ice-pale eyes crinkle at the corners. "Well, I'm glad to have met you, Inspector." "Same here, Mrs. Holmes. Do have a lovely evening out," he says, turning politely aside as she passes to follow after Sherlock. "And a very happy birthday," he adds in his mind, watching her go. He waits there at the landing, allowing her a decent head start before descending at a thoughtful pace. It was on this day that a certain 4-year-old had decided to run away from the loud party at his home, utterly ruining 17-year-old Greg's second date with Cheryl Frankley. The incident had made Mummy's birthday practically unforgettable. Still, it isn't a date he tends to mark, and he hadn't put the pieces together today until he'd seen her face. God, it's really almost April already, he realizes, slowing further on the stairs. With Berkeley newly promoted and transferred, the amount of legwork Greg can delegate has decreased. The time has flown by, busy days and nights blurring together against unremarkable routine. All in all, it's been nearly 15 weeks since Sherlock had started the feud between them, and of course, Greg's been just as much to blame for keeping it going. It's easier to stay angry, letting Sherlock's childish behavior fuel the perpetual cycle. Honestly, Greg still feels a bit safer this way. How easy might it be for him to let the wrong thing slip if he keeps allowing himself to treat his consultant with the fondness he can't help feeling? For whatever reason, Sherlock has clearly decided to reject any sign of affection, pushing for a return to the more sterile working relationship they'd begun with 3 years ago. He surely doesn't realize that the sterility had originated in Greg's fear. Still, at some point soon, Greg knows he'll have to find a way to settle the score. It's been a slow and bloodless battle, but if it escalates much further, it'll interfere with casework. Neither of them wants that. With this in mind, he digs a hand into his pocket as he reaches the street, pausing in vague surprise to find only one item within. His phone is there, but as for the small leatherette flip that holds his warrant card, "Fine, you Burke, give," he sighs to himself, pulling out the phone. Dr. Hooper is in a fairly good position to grant him the favor. Dr. Stern had retired from St. Bartholomew's the previous summer, leaving her jointly in charge of the mortuary's operations with serious, quiet Carter Emile. Greg still stops in with coffee once every few weeks to laugh with Molly about work-related misadventures and the latest strange tales of her dating life. But now he gets to come directly to her for cases as well. Sometimes he works with Dr. Emile, too. His postmortems are thorough and clean-cut, but Greg always feels he gets more out of Molly's work. She seems to think on a similar frequency to Greg, and she's comfortable enough around him to say whatever she has on her mind, be it a soft, sympathetic observation as she unzips a body bag, or a startlingly wry witticism spoken over a bowl of organs. He's certain he can convince her to agree to his plan. When he gets her on the line, she's just finished a long shift and she's on her way home to get ready for a date. "Collins asked me to dinner," she reports. "Colin again?" he asks, briefly sidetracked. "The goth who looks like Cupid? Thought you gave him the heave-ho for being creepy." "I did, yes, but he's promised me no more graveyards this time, no more asking me to come into the morgue. He really is sweet." "Uh-huh. Well, I wish you the best, as usual. Look, I have a big favor to ask of you." She's surprised and intrigued as he explains the point of his call. "I don't think I've even heard you mention this consultant of yours more than once or twice," she says, stifling a delicate yawn that tickles in the earpiece of his phone. "What sort of experiments is he planning?" Who knows with him? Truth be told, Mols, I don't understand a quarter of it. A lot of different chemical things and forensic research. Precisely how long does it take fingernails to degrade in lye? Weird stuff like that. He says he's building an extensive knowledge base to help him solve future crimes. I'm sure at least some of it is just because he's bored. "Okay, what kind of arrangements are you looking for?" "Basic access, a little supervision. I'd rather let you work out your terms with him. Far be it from me to know what he'll ask for or to presume anything on your behalf. Mainly, I just want him doing his thing somewhere there's other people around. Someone who at least has a general idea what he's up to, so he can't do anything truly stupid." "This doesn't exactly sound promising, Greg," she sighs, and he grins. "Wait till you meet him. You'll see what I mean. Smartest bloody idiot I've known in my life." Molly takes a few days to consider the lab share proposition before getting back to him, and it's a few more before she reports that she's freed up a block of time to meet. Greg has only seen Sherlock once in the interim, near the successful close of the chalk dust case. Sherlock had turned up at the yard without warning to bother him about something he wanted asked in the interrogation. Unfortunately, Greg had been tied up on a phone call just then and hadn't seen him coming. Sally Donovan had been the one to intercept him. That had gone down about as quietly as a sick badger trapped in a bag of cats. After Greg had shut down Sally's protests, he'd taken Sherlock by the arm and marched him out to the lifts, allowing no discussion until they were alone on their way down. "You do know why she does that, right?" he'd asked, crossing his arms. "Fragile ego, poor attitude, and lack of respect for intelligence," Sherlock had sniffed. "Oh, and the fact that I just caught her about to misfile the photographs from the search of Hubert Bullins's flat. She'd pulled a completely unrelated file and was putting them in with interview transcripts for a Jamie Bullard. It was horrendous inattention. You should be thankful I stopped her before she mucked anything else up for you." "Jesus, but you don't go by halves, do you?" "No, Sherlock, I was going to point out that you still look very much like the same crazed drug addict who gave her fits 3 years back. But you so much as bought a new shirt since you moved out of Shoreditch." The strange look Sherlock had thrown him had made Greg bite his cheek, scrabbling through his memories to determine whether he perhaps shouldn't have known which neighborhood. But thankfully, the accusatory response had ignored his potential slip. "You saw me with my mother last week, and now you'd rather I dressed more professionally, live up to the example set by my posh git of a brother. No need to go overboard. I'm not saying I want to see you in waistcoats and ties, God no, but a little effort goes a long way as far as the impression you give, and I know you know it." "Of course I know. What do you think For God's sake, Lestrade, it must be incredibly dull to be as dense as you." Then the lift had opened onto the lobby, and Sherlock had walked out without another word. That was 2 days ago. Today, Greg's outside the northern entrance at Bart's, enjoying a leisurely cigarette as he waits for 3 o'clock. It's the late end of lunch, and there's a steady trickle of people making their way back inside to work or class. Greg leans against the sun-warmed stone of the wall, one foot propped up behind him, and watches. He's not exactly scanning the passers-by for Sherlock, though he expects him shortly. Still, it's startling to catch a glimpse of the man coming his way. The familiar shabby windbreaker has been replaced with a dark gray Macintosh, which flaps open around what is clearly a suit, visible even at this distance. Greg averts his eyes immediately. He ducks his head and takes a long drag of smoke to hide his smile. Soon Sherlock appears beside him, a dark shape rising up in the corner of Greg's eye from a sudden squatting motion. "You've dropped your phone," he says, offering it. "Clumsy." "Have I? Oh, ta." Greg nods, surprised as much by Sherlock's relatively mild-mannered greeting as by his own unnoticed carelessness. Slipping the device back into its accustomed place reminds him of what else he keeps in that pocket, and he grits his teeth for a moment. But today is for peacemaking, and he's already acquired a replacement anyway, so he decides to let it go. "I'll let Sherlock have his mischief, just this once, without the added satisfaction of hearing me fuss about it." After one more quick drag, he stubs out the butt and turns to look Sherlock up and down. "Changed your mind about rebellion, eh?" "Testing out a different strategy." "Yeah, all right." He doesn't pursue the topic. Instead, he pushes away from the wall, gesturing for Sherlock to follow. "Come on, then." Greg expects some of Sherlock's usual banter, if not more half-hearted insults than running commentary on his team's current caseload, but Sherlock refrains, ghosting along behind him through hallways and stairwells without comment. When Greg glances back, unnerved by the silence, he's not sure what to make of the softly pensive expression his consultant wears. "So, I'm sure you've already figured it out," he says over his shoulder as he opens the door of the mortuary office. "But I've asked you to meet me here because I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. This is Dr. Molly Hooper. Molly, meet Sherlock Holmes." Molly's eyes flip past Greg to the man walking in behind him, and she blinks. And blinks again. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Holmes." She gets out in a rush, stepping sideways around a desk and nearly tripping on a chair in the process. "Likewise," responds Sherlock, and then his voice drops smoothly into a rumbling low register. "It must be terribly interesting to manage the mortuary at such a fine teaching hospital, Dr. Hooper. May I call you Molly?" "Yes, please do. And you should call me Sherlock, of course. I wouldn't have it any other way. Hearing Mr. Holmes makes me look round for my father." She giggles, little more than a stifled squeak, and spots of color tint her cheeks. "Lay it on a little thicker, why don't you?" thinks Greg, frowning faintly. He's prepared to break in on the conversation, but Molly is already regaining her composure and forging ahead onto firmer ground, asking questions about Sherlock's equipment needs and preferred working hours. Certainly, Sherlock is applying rather more charm than Greg's ever known him to genuinely possess, but isn't this pleasant, polite cooperation far preferable to a cruel takedown or a screaming row? Greg's services as a facilitator are clearly unneeded. Eventually, as conversation veers abruptly from mass spectrometry into the territory of surplus cadaver parts, he wanders off in search of coffee. The meeting is winding down by the time he returns. As Greg watches, Sherlock spreads on a final layer of honey. It's obvious, even to Greg's far less appreciative eyes, that the thrust of Sherlock's head as he offers his hand to shake is calculated to accentuate the long, graceful column of his neck, perfectly framed in the open collar of his black shirt. "Bloody show-off," he huffs silently, but he can't help but grin at Molly's frankly dazzled look when he steps in to thank her and say his own goodbye. Sherlock has waited for him in the hall outside the laboratory, another consideration Greg wasn't sure whether to expect. "You've planned on doing this for quite some time," he states, falling into step alongside Greg. "A little while, yeah. Figured with an arrangement like this you could do more satisfying work, and I'd be less likely to get another courtesy call from my dispatcher friend." Well, you're probably right at any rate. I'm looking forward to starting some new experiments. Molly says she can get me feet next week." "Good for her," says Greg with a weak smile. Sherlock falls silent again, no doubt already engrossed in potential plans for feet. They're within sight of the doors by which they'd entered when Sherlock suddenly stops walking and asks, "Do you expect my unending gratitude for this?" "Oh, now that'd be brilliant," Greg quips, "but I'd settle for just a little consideration. You know, you haven't been a picnic to work with lately." Sherlock cocks his head slightly. "Truce, then." It makes Greg want to laugh, and he's not sure why, but he keeps a tight hold on the brittle bubble of mirth. "All right, truce. Well, I've an appointment with the tailor in a bit. I'd best be off. Text me when you get another case that isn't entirely boring." Nodding crisply, Sherlock begins to stride off. Before he reaches the door, however, he pauses and turns back. "Oh, and Lestrade? Yeah? You might like to know that your wife has been carrying on an extramarital affair." He says it in an odd, muted tone, as if it were a kindness somehow, or repayment, as if he hasn't just set off a murder charge somewhere in the vicinity of Greg's chest. When he turns away again and quietly leaves, Greg stays behind, utterly bewildered and hurt.